All right, everyone but Adam is seated, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Not to call any special attention. Oh, Russ is not there either. All right. Well, welcome everyone to our first tax session for 2014. We have a very large agenda in front of us for the year with a full slate of new working groups and new activities under those working groups, so a lot in front of us. We're also starting the new year with a few new members, and that's a good thing. And I should have spotted where everyone was sitting, but Steve Lanning, where are you? There you are. Okay. Steve is here from Viasat, and this is his first meeting, so welcome to you, Steve. This one is we're going to have a lot of fun with this. John Dobbins, it's his first meeting from Earthlink, and at the end of, or not quite the end, but the lunch period, he let me know that he would be about a half an hour late. So when he comes in, we'll have to give him a round of applause or something appropriate so that he can slip in without being noticed. And then Fred Kemmer. There you are, Fred. Yeah. Fred actually was on the phone so for his first meeting in December, but this is his first in-person meeting, if I've got this correct.
That's right.
And so welcome in person.
Thank you.
To have a face that goes with voices over the lines, but we're glad to have you all here. Maybe since we've done introductions, we'll do a quick once around and introduce yourself and your roles in your respective organizations. And maybe this is going to be real scary, but introduce also the working group that you believe that you are engaged with. Because as we go forward, that will be one of the goals, and we'll have our panel of experts here who will be duly noting, checking off, or otherwise adding the people into their respective working groups. I should also take note, although somehow, Russ, you were moved, I don't know how that happened, but we had at one point the tent cards aligned so that we actually had the chairs of the working groups in a row, so that...
That's still the case. By the way.
Yeah, well, except that Russ is not there, but I guess...
That's Russ's chair.
That's where the chair came from. Yeah, that's right, and it's appropriate because, Russ, you're working with David, so it really is. No, but we do have the chairs. Some of you who are old timers with the TAC will note the point at which our current FCC chair performed a terrible transgression. He took the clicker to advance the slides and tossed it across the table to the next speaker. It was a transgression that he was severely reprimanded on, and we never did that again. But since then, we have been passing or moving the baton around the table, and it finally occurred to me today that we actually have a simpler way if we sit in order with the chairs together so that you can pass. So this is one more giant step forward in the progression of the TAC. What's that?
Is that repacking?
Oh boy, it's going to be one of those meetings. So, and I guess I started it, so I have no one to blame but myself. So, since Walter isn't in his assigned seating, we'll go left around the table and end with Walter. Julie, who are you?
It's Julie Knapp with the Office of Engineering and Technology, and I've been mostly liaison with the Spectrum and Receivers Group.
Dale Hatfield, University of Colorado, and it looks like the Spectrum and Receivers Group. Yep.
Henning Schultz-Wenning, FCC, Office of Strategic Planning, mostly network transitions.
Shahid Ahmed with Accenture. I think I'm part of the Internet of Things, but we'll see as the day progresses.
You'll realign yourself.
Fred Kemmer, GenBand. We're continuing on PSTN transition, and we're hoping to contribute to Internet of Things.
Jesse Russell, Link Networks. I'm with the Spectrum and Receiver Group. Ramani Pandurangan. I'm part of the cybersecurity. I'm from XL Communications, Vice President Network Engineering. And also, I think I'm also on another work group, Internet of Things, perhaps.
Great. Vishen Andlal, I'm the CTO for Ericsson in North America, and we're looking to contribute to the Internet of Things, the shared spectrum, and the receivers.
All right. Brian Mark Walter, Senior Vice President of Research and Standards at the Consumer Electronics Association. I'm on the Spectrum and Receivers Working Group and IoT.
Hi, I'm Glenn Tyndall. I'm the Service Provider Sector CTO, and I'm on the Internet of Things Working Group as well.
I'm Marvin Serbu. I'm here as a special government employee, and I'm on the IP Transition Working Group.
I'm Greg Lappin. I'm from ARRL, and I'm continuing with the Spectrum and Receivers Group.
I'm Paul Meisner at Amazon, and David Tennenhouse was doing some pretty effective lobbying at lunch, so I think I'll be joining the IoT group as well.
Kevin Kahn, Intel. I think I'm on the IP transition. I've been running as hard as I can to get away from sharing, but I think I'm actually still going to contribute some to sharing because they keep getting dragged back there because of my CSMAC experience, I think.
Hi, I'm Peter Bloom from General Atlantic, and I'm on the IP transition team. I'm also volunteering to lead the IP-based digital clicker initiative so that we will forever do away with the physical clicker.
That's great. That's very good. Hi, I'm Nomi Bergman. I'm president of Bright House Networks, and I'm with the supporting the transition to IP working group. Thanks.
I'm Brian Daly. I'm the director for the strategic standards within AT&T Labs, and I'm co-leading with Ed Chan of Verizon the Advanced Sharing and Enabling Wireless Technologies Group.
It's causing me some nervousness that the chairs are having to look up and read what they're chairing.
I'm David Tennenhouse. I'm a corporate VP at Microsoft in the Technology and Research Group. I lead particularly technology and policy. And I'm co-chairing with Russ the Internet of Things group. And actually, we do need some help from you two guys. So we'll be also lobbying to get you guys in.
I'll take yours. I'm Paul Steinberg, CTO of Motorola. I am still trying to get the security thing right. So this year I'm leading the cybersecurity group. Motorola will also be contributing to the Spectrum or the sharing group and the receivers group.
I'm Lynn Claudy, Senior Vice President of Technology at the National Association of Broadcasters. I'm the new chair of the Spectrum and Receiver Performance Group and also participating in the Advanced Sharing Group.
I'm Steve Lanning. I'm with Viasat, and I'm working on the transition to IP.
Hi, Jack Nishelski. I'm in the research group at Qualcomm. I'm on the transitions, IoT, and I've recruited some help for the sharing group.
I'm Doug Jones from Verizon. I'm here representing Ed Chan today, and I'll be on the transition to IP.
Hi, this is Russ Jurek. I'm with Cisco in the CTO group. I'm co-chairing the Internet of Things with David. We're Thing 1 and Thing 2, and I will be participating in the IP transition as well. And by the way, we definitely would like more members in the IoT group, so just contact us.
Okay. Mark Bayless from VisualLink, and I'll be on the IP transition, shared spectrum, and the IoT.
I'm Mark Richer. I'm the president of the Advanced Television Systems Committee, and I know I volunteered to be on the transition to IP, so I must be on one of the other groups.
Hi, Pierre de Vries, Senior Fellow at the Silicon Flatiron Center at the University of Colorado, Spectrum and Receivers.
Okay. I'm Adam Drobot from Open TechWorks, and I'll be supporting the IoT group, Thing 3, and a little bit on the spectrum sharing.
Marty Cooper, Dyna. I'm on the Internet of Things and still on Spectrum and Sharing.
Hi, I'm Teresa Hennessy with Comcast. I'm on the IP transition, and we're hoping to contribute to the Internet of Things.
John Chapin. I'm here as a special government employee, and I'm serving on the Advanced Sharing Group.
Mark Bregman, CTO of Newstar, and we're participating in supporting the transition IP.
So I'm Lynn Merrill. I'm here representing NTCA. I'm their vice chair as far as the technical committee. We're going to go ahead and work on or hopefully have the opportunity to work on the cybersecurity initiative and supporting the IP transition. And if we have an opportunity, maybe a little bit on the spectrum receiver performance.
Hi, I'm Harold Tietz. I'm the CIO, CTO at TW Telecom in Denver, and planning on cybersecurity and transition to the IP network.
I'm Kevin Sparks. I'm a CTO partner in the corporate CTO organization at Alcatel-Lucent, and I expect to be participating in the sharing group and perhaps in the receivers group on related topics. And I'm very glad about the new clicker policy, because this way I won't have to mop up water from my place anymore.
Michael Huff from Office of Engineering and Technology at FCC. I'm a FCC liaison to the Advanced Sharing Working Group.
Okay, this is Walter Johnston with the Office of Engineering and Technology here at the FCC, and I'm the liaison to the Dr. Seuss Internet of Things group.
And again, I am Dennis Roberson and have the wonderful opportunity to serve as your chair. And now is the time when we can all give John a round of applause for joining us. So I told them, John, in pre-introducing you that we would make sure to give you a good welcome, except that they have your name wrong, isn't it?
We'll work on that for next time.
Yeah. So anyway, we're at least, well, not even close. But you're welcome nonetheless. I'm glad to have you here. We're going to dive right into the working group presentations. I will apologize on behalf of us in not getting the working groups organized as expeditiously as we had hoped in the December meeting. So I know that some of you are just barely getting organized at this point. But do appreciate, first of all, the chairs taking the roles that you have all accepted and for jumping in. Our goal today, first goal actually, was what we largely accomplished with everyone identifying themselves around the table, because we're late enough in getting things organized that making sure that we know who is thing one and thing two and thing three really was an important part of what we wanted to accomplish in this meeting. Now, there are some who are not here or who are on the phone potentially. Do we have on the phone, Walter?
The bridge is up.
Is there anyone on the phone that can chime in? I'm not hearing anyone. I did have some emails that suggested that some of our members might be on the phone. So if you are out there, we'll want to make sure that those of you who have not formally gotten yourselves connected, that you do so with the groups. So that was was and is a key objective. So coming out of this meeting, we should have refined lists of the working groups. The second key objective was basically to lay out the actions and the plans of the group. And there have been some dialogues back and forth, particularly with different ones of the chairs, on how to do that and how far to go and all. There was an outline of the goals for each of the groups that largely came from either you all with your input or as ratified and as amplified by members of the FCC, and the gentleman to my immediate left had a great deal to do with that. This is what I want. And so and that's what we're here for. We're here to support the FCC, and certainly a lot of focus is rested and centered in the Office of Engineering Technology within the FCC. So Julie's input is highly valued. Having said that, the goal was for each of the chairs and within the context of your group to refine those goals and to look at the members of your group who you have just established and determine where you can take things. And I recognize it will be crude at this point, and I've had some encouragement, particularly from David, on You want recommendations? Are you crazy? We just got started. Something, very refined and professional like that. And to which the response was, you're right, that at this point it is going to be the areas that expect to be looking at. But hopefully we will be very quickly coming to actionable recommendations that can be laid out. As you recall, our previous chair, who has been elevated to a different chair role, always talked to us about actionable recommendations. And he was right. That's what our goal should be here, to come out with things that the FCC can grab and run with. Happily, there is a fair track record over the last few years of things that have been recommended by this body that have been adopted and run with, and I won't take the time to amplify on all of those at this time. We have in past meetings, and we will in future meetings, but there have been really quite a number of significant suggestions, proposals that have come out of this work group that are in action in one way or another, either implemented or being implemented, and we can all feel very, very good about the legacy that has been established through that. So, carrying on from the legacy to the future, let's jump in, and we will start out with Lynn talking about spectrum and receivers, and Walter is quickly jumping to the keyboard to bring up the slides. I will admit to the whole group that I'm terribly disappointed with Lynn in that he's not carrying on the tradition of the past chair of this group, who I don't think ever put in a set of slides that weren't changed at the very last minute. So it's really quite disappointing to me that Lynn put in his slides several days ago and they're the same today. It's very...
On that point, I think I mentioned to Dennis more than once that when you have something titled Final Presentation Version 5, it really does belie the title.
All right, Lynn, please take it away.
We'll see if the group can recognize the mistakes in the slides. Dennis was the previous chair of this group, and he was obviously trying to chair too many things. So ultimately, I was asked to be chair and subject myself to lots of comments of things sure went better when Dennis was the chair, but that's okay. So we agreed Dennis's legacy is the greatest chair of all. But here we are. So we'll go on to our first slide. Many of these people you heard introduced and are in the room. This is a carryover working group from the previous TAC. We do have some old members of the group, some new members of the group from Ericsson, Kumar Balachandran and Patrick Walsh from Verizon, and Milind Budicott from Lucent Alcatel, and also Jesse Russell is new to the group but not new to the TAC. So this is our group as we knew it this morning, but I think we probably need to look again and make sure that we have everyone represented appropriately there. So this is our proposed mission for 2014, to make recommendations in 3 areas that are focused on improving access to and making efficient use of the radio spectrum from a holistic and systems and receiver perspective. Secondly, we're going to try to provide support as the Commission considers TAC recommendations related to the previously proposed interference limits policy that the group was responsible for putting forward in the previous cycle. And then thirdly, we've elevated this to our mission statement to analyze and make recommendations related to enforcement issues, given that the RF environment is rapidly changing and it may not be a business as usual kind of function in the future. So I will try to explain each of those in a little more detail, but hopefully brevity is a virtue. So moving to specific items, we have 3 general areas of focus. First, we had promised several white papers and TAC briefings last year and had planned to publish or launch those efforts early this year. We are perhaps a little bit behind, but not much behind, and I'll explain where those action items are at. Second, we have follow-on work to do in further developing the multi-stakeholder group organization concept, and that was part of the group's work in interference limits policy. And specifically, we proposed developing a charter and the initial starting conditions for a multi-stakeholder group that could work in the area of the 3.5 gigahertz band, which is currently under consideration by the FCC. And because it's under consideration by the FCC, we have to deftly maneuver and be careful in that topic area, since it is a live FCC proceeding, and the TAC members don't want to violate the ex parte rules or the Advisory Committee Act guidance. So our FCC liaisons are very important in guiding us through this, but they're confident that we can add to the body of knowledge and the direction that this proceeding eventually takes without violating any rules and sending them to jail. I don't think we're going to jail, but they might. So we like them. We don't want to see that happen. But this is a desirable band for multi-stakeholder success, we think, and a good place to try to take that approach to mitigate interference issues that might be potentially troubling otherwise. Then third, we have input developing on the general topic of interference resolution enforcement and radio noise. Some of this was sketched out in our 2013 report, but we would develop it in more and hopefully, Dennis's word, actionable detail. So some of these actions would be creating an open environment for sharing information about all the interference situations as they happen in industry and in government today, and also to take a look at the rising noise floor, which we all believe it's happening, but the evidence supporting that is maybe not as quantified as you'd like to be. And then we have some recommendations about how to address generally RF environment challenges that are seen as trends that would cause some concern in the future if things don't change how enforcement is done. So in the area of wrap-up items, we have three of those. The interference limits white paper that was published last year, as you may know, was a rather daunting document. It was 100 pages long, and we promised a Cliff Notes kind of summary version as an introduction to the topic for those that didn't want to take on a long reading assignment. So that's been done, and a white paper with pages that number in the single digits is now, it was pre-distributed to the TAC members, and then subsequently last week was published to the TAC website. So our first action item we can claim we've already finished. And it is a good readable introduction to the subject. So we'd particularly like to thank Pierre DeVries for giving birth and life to that document. It's much appreciated, and I think you'll appreciate it too if you can take the time to look at it. Second, we had also promised a white paper on an introduction to interference resolution enforcement and radio noise, and that's an effort that is being shepherded by Dale Hatfield. It is currently in draft form. It's almost ready, but it's undergoing a little more peer review in the working group, and we do plan to distribute that to the TAC either this month or possibly next month at the latest. We think it has some thought-provoking, hopefully not provocative, ideas about what enforcement means in the era of modern communication systems that are certainly compared to old systems, intelligent and able to do some self-policing of their own, perhaps. But we don't think this is going to put the Enforcement Bureau out of business or make them take their direction-finding vehicles and take them to the dump. But intelligence systems do imply that there are new interference avoidance technologies and techniques and methods out there that have some relevance, perhaps, for how the FCC prepares itself for the future of intelligent communications. And then finally, we have a subgroup that is led by Jeff Mendenhall, Dave Gurney, and Greg Lappin in our group that's working on it will end up being a presentation on new technologies that affect interference mitigation. And that will include topics on new receiver hardware technology and techniques such as dynamic interference cancellation, and the impact and timeline for what is the practicality. We all know that the theory of software-defined radio is great, but the practical side and timeline of SDR technology will be in that presentation, which we expect to be ready in the April to June timeframe, and we'll socialize it in phases with the working group and with other working groups, and hopefully the whole TAC eventually. So next, some detail on multi-stakeholder organizations, and the next step for that. We're proposing to go to the next level of actually defining a charter and a scope for a multi-stakeholder group to be specific to the issues in the 3.5 gigahertz band. So this would be classical development of goals and objectives, and then specific recommendations on how the group would actually operate, what its governance would be, what its schedule would be, whether the schedule could be broken into logical phases, and finally the often overlooked but incredibly important topic of funding. How would it operate and be able to keep operating, and is that feasible or not? On interference limits and spectrum access policy, we plan to evaluate practical use cases and take real interference scenarios as examples that can come up and see how the interference limits policy would apply to those. So that would get into how policies would actually work between stakeholders that either operate in the band or adjacent to the band, and how the policy implementation would be rolled out and actually deployed. So we think some areas that need to be considered, the statistical considerations of how interference actually occurs, to try to meld that into the policy, and perhaps to have a template of standard questions about receiver performance, which is always an important part of the interference equation, but generally not dealt with on the regulation side of that interference equation. So how does that fit in trying to stay in the middle of that issue? And then finally, to develop awareness of inter-system interference situations that receiver designers may need to face, and ought to design their products so that they, a priori, avoid those situations wherever they can. Then on interference resolution and enforcement and radio noise, we do have the broad white paper that will be targeted for release within the next month. And then in the near term, the group would like to repeat and emphasize some of our recommendations from the December TAC meeting. We think that there is wisdom to be gleaned from looking at a combination and an aggregation of all the interference complaints that are not all publicly available, but all publicly, well, maybe not publicly filed, but if all the interference situations that were out there were put into a file that could be accessed in summary form, we think that this would aid in studying the full gamut of interference situations and scope the real problem that eventually needs to be tackled. So right now only a few of mostly the things that have to be solved in debate and through the notice and comment rulemaking cycle end up getting in the public's hands. Next slide. This is also a restatement of what we asked in December. We still think it would be useful, and that would be that the Commission convene a workshop, and this would be a workshop of experts to take a fresh look at the state-of-the-art in interference resolution and enforcement with a modern view of how RF spectrum is being used. There are both academic and industry practitioners that are working at the edges of advancing the interference resolution and enforcement functions. So we think it would help the FCC to think about this if a public workshop were held with those entities and somewhat hit the reset key and say, if you were starting over and you knew what you know now about the RF environment and the kind of devices that are going to be in it and the demand for using it, and you had some awareness as to how it's likely to grow in the near term and maybe the midterm, how would you organize the functions of interference resolution and enforcement, and how would you evolve from where you are today to that desired operating point in the future? So that's a request from last year. On the next slide, we also had some recommendations from our working group. First, just find a way to be able to share information about interference incidents. We think a public-private kind of partnership would be a way to achieve this, just so the problem of interference and the scope and the order of magnitude of it could be better understood, because it's a bigger problem than we all think it is, because we only see parts of the elephant. Second, if you have knowledge of the increasingly challenging interference environment, to take a look at some of the new strategies that are appropriate, perhaps out of our white paper and other areas that are appropriate for handling those challenges. And then third, on the noise floor issue, there is certainly water-cooled wisdom about the RF noise floor is rising. There is some evidence that's been quantified, and we all know we'll eventually be engulfed by the radio noise that's ambiently being spewed out from various sources. But there is not a structured approach for the real evidence to say in different bands in different places and at different rates what is going on with the noise floor. And our group would like to look at that and take a stab at understanding the reality of how noise floor is actually being elevated, in what way, and what its likely impact, absent other intervention, might be on the radio services. Lastly, on this, the concept of looking at emission limits, primarily the conventions that are in the FCC for allowable out-of-band emissions that's used by the commissions in many proceedings. Is there a change that is really warranted there? And if you wanted to make a change, how realistic or unrealistic is it to attempt to do that? So this is our last slide, and this is the schedule slide, milestones, and subject to change certainly, and they start out very specific and get very vague by the end. So as we go through the year, hopefully the goals of the later quarters will be more well defined. This quarter, certainly, we're going to get out the white papers on interference limits, which was already done, so I can say that with certainty. The white paper on interference resolution needs to get finished, and we'll begin socializing the emerging technologies presentation. In the third quarter, we'll concentrate on the multi-stakeholder group for the 3.5 gigahertz band and look at making recommendations for analyzing interference based on its statistical appearance and how it's treated statistically. And hopefully the workshop on interference will be a possible kind of thing and will take place and would inform, we think, follow-on investigations for the new ways of approaching interference resolution and enforcement. And then the fourth quarter right here, it basically says we'll finish all our other work, and we'll need to refine the milestones for that quarter later in this quarter or in the third quarter. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that completes our reports. We have individual members of the group that are expert in the various topic areas that we're dealing with, and happy to answer questions or continue the discussion on any of those issues.
Great. Per our normal TAC procedure, as you would like to make a comment or ask a question, please put your tent card up. I'm not seeing any tent cards around the table. Oh, okay,
I just have one small one. There was, in the document that you passed out, there was a reference to FCC support to Model City and then another to evaluate agile technologies for sharing and coexistence. I was just wondering, Like if those were also things that would be addressed, or if you had any thoughts on those.
I
That
think
was an
that
early
is probably
document.
from the earlier draft,
Oh,
and
is
those
it?
things where there
Okay.
was overlap between groups there. Maybe Walter or,
Yeah, we
or Dennis
moved
wants
that
to
into the
address that.
advanced sharing group, recognizing there was some overlap. So
Okay. That's great.
Good. We'll have to get you an up-to-date version.
Oh, sorry.
Any other comments or questions? One that I had for the whole group, as Lynn noted, the working group did send out this introduction to interference limits policy, and we didn't get a lot of feedback from the group. Was there any comments around the document itself for the group? Did anyone get it and read it? Not seeing a lot of jumping up. Well, few heads nodding. So that's useful. The group did expend a fair amount of energy. It's always an interesting characteristic. I guess Ernest Hemingway talked about this. Trying to write a small document is much, much harder than writing a long document. So the 100-page version took X amount of time. Doing it an 8-page version took 5X, wasn't it, Pierre? But it was considerably more challenging to put a succinct version of the interference limits policy document together and to polish it up. And so hopefully, if you have not had a chance to look at that document, you will have a chance, or pass it along to people within your organizations that you believe will find value with that document. Second item that Lynn, yes, oh, great.
Yeah, perfect, thanks. I'm guilty of not having read the report, so potentially this was addressed in the report. But what are you guys localizing the interference relative to a particular spectrum band? And how are you characterizing it from a statistical perspective? Is it time, spatial, frequency? Can you give me a little bit of perspective on that?
Well, I think the interference limits policy was meant to be general in nature and apply to whatever band it might seem appropriate to do so. The nature of the statistical interference, I think the answer to your question is yes. It was time, frequency, and location probabilities. It's a particular area that Pierre de Vries is interested in. So I don't know if you have some amplification of where you think the emphasis on the statistical nature of the investigation would go.
Yeah, so just a couple of thoughts on that.
You're bringing up
Yep, there we go. So the general principle of interference limits is generic in that it specifies in-band and out-of-band energy levels that shouldn't be exceeded, and if they are, then one can claim harm, but the particular values would vary from case to case, so it's not a one-size-fits-all set of parameters. As far as the statistics go, the way we're looking at it at this point is the field strength would be defined as not to exceed a certain field strength at more than a certain percentage of locations and a percentage of times at a given confidence level. And so let's say you say it's the 90th percentile and then 95% confidence level. So that's how you would do the statistics. And as you, of course, you start drilling down, then you ask questions, which we look for precedents in existing rules, and we don't often find it. But there are questions like, well, over what kind of measurement area? Over what measurement time window? And I think as we start looking at these things in more detail, you'll see more of those things being specified, not just for interference limits rules, but actually for FCC rules more generally.
Maybe an important point that I should make, a much more general point than this specific document, but these documents as they're published are published as TAC documents. So the review cycle was a non-trivial part of the exercise. The working group did its work, finished it up, happy with what they had done, but sending it out to the whole group prior to its publication said that you all had a couple of weeks to take a look at it and make it your own. So when it's published, it is a TAC document, and as we publish other documents, they would all have that same characteristic. That's part of the discipline on the way out the door. Next point that and this is always a tricky one, and people will smile immediately, is the noise area. I did this again I sat through part of the meeting this morning for the Spectrum Receivers Group. But noise has been a hot button item for me since the original TAC in 1999 when we started the TAC. Noise was one of the first items that we addressed, and Dale and Julie and I, and for that matter Marvin, were all there for that round, and maybe others. But this has been a hot button item for the TAC for the last 15 years is the point. And yet it's still as unresolved now as it was 15 years ago. We're all still worried. It's still the water cooler, as Lynn described it, item that we all are worried that someday noise is going to engulf us all, and all existing wireless services will succumb to the noise as it rises up, just like we're concerned about the oceans rising and Florida disappearing under the ocean surface. It's one of those kinds of things. And yet when we get down to the concrete evidence that reinforces the water cooler knowledge, it's really very limited. So I guess I'd call on the TAC to support the Spectrum Receiver Working Group insofar as you have information that would contribute in this area. It would be wonderful if this was the year that we really nailed this down. And there's a lot more discussions now about this. Gee, we've got satellites, and maybe the satellites, when they're going over the ocean, would be able to see what the real baseline is, and when they're over Washington, D.C., the east coast of the United States, they would see the noise, and we could spot it that way. Or airplanes similarly flying, because we do have airplanes in the sky, or balloons, or other platforms. Google with your balloons, maybe you can help us with that. But getting at this one is sort of personal, is what I've shared with you, but I think it is a hot item, and certainly it is of considerable interest to the FCC, because it does have enormous impact as we would go forward. So special plea for the whole group around that subject. All right, very good.
Having been there back with you when we started on this,
yeah, Greg should be in it.
One thing that I learned about this, and that I don't think we'll get an answer from it, which is a good thing, is that it's a moving target, and it has been for the last 12 to 14 years. We commissioned a study, and people tried to figure out what's happening to the noise floor in the Wi-Fi band, and then as they were studying it, it was changing. And we concluded that it wasn't going to work, and then somehow they made it work. And I have a feeling that all of these noise floor issues are going to be a moving target, and we'll never get an answer. But that's a good thing, because that means that we're catching up with it.
Jesse?
Yes, yeah. We've worked this multi-stakeholder issue for quite some time, and I think it might be helpful if Julie or John, I don't know if John is here, might give us a status of where we are with the 3.5 band effort, such that we know what flexibility we have or don't have in terms of working that within the group.
Sure. So we had said publicly that we're planning a further notice of proposed rulemaking with more details on what we have in mind for the rules. So that's not too far off. I can't say anything more specific than that. And our thought was we'd have recommendations coming out of this group for the charter and how the group would work and so forth, and then actually try and get it up and running. We've had a lot of interest in 3.5. We've got a framework that we had discussed back in the workshop, a few frameworks. And so our thought is that this would be a good place, since we've got different parties all kind of sharing the same space, to work together to define some of the more technical issues, like, well, what are reasonable expectations in designing equipment that you should have for performance. So,
No, I'm
so
sorry,
it
go
won't be
ahead,
too
finish.
far away, assuming all the pieces fall in place to
Oh, okay.
actually start this.
No, that's what I was really asking about before we could actually do work on it, right? We'd have to have some feeling for when we can work on it.
Okay, no tent cards up. Let's move on to cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is an extremely challenging area, as you all recognize. This is one where you open a newspaper and you see this one. It's also a complex issue in that there are so many entities that are involved in this one. So it really is a difficult, albeit very important item for us. Final item that makes it interesting is the context of the FCC itself, where the focus in this area has just changed with a new player, a new chief for the Public Safety Bureau, and so Paul and company have had their arms full to get this one started and running. But you've got experience doing these things last year, so as you pointed out, sooner or later you're bound to get this one right.
Yeah.
So. Paul,
Thanks.
take it away.
Thanks, Dennis. I think you have a gift for understatement in terms of complexity and importance of this area for the national economy. This is, I think, largely a recast or a reformation of last year's group, which focused on cloud security, if you recall. And that was a fascinating topic that we delved into, and it proved that it was probably more complex than even we'd initially envisaged. The challenge with cyber is, I think, a couple of things. One is, as Dennis said, I don't think you can overstate the importance of it. The second thing is a lot of people in this area have recognized that, and there's a lot of activity going on in that area with other three-letter acronym agencies that are within 20 miles of here, I'll say. So the tricky part will be, as you kind of alluded to, is to sort out what's the best role for the FCC and how can they amplify those activities or collaborate in a productive way to further advance the cause. So we're very early days. My presentation will be much shorter. Perfect. It's totally unreadable. Absolutely perfect. No. Actually, actually you guys provided this. You guys provided this, Julie. So I just chose not to make it readable on multiple slides. So this was actually the mission statement that we're working with Jeff Goldthorpe, who's our FCC liaison on this topic. And we connected last week for the first time on the reformation of the group. So we're nearly as farly along as some of the other work groups. So we're just at the very beginning days. But this, I think, says a lot in and of itself, even if you can't read it. So let me pull out a couple of things that I think are important here. Keyword collaboration is used quite a bit or implied quite a bit here, and collaboration between industry and government organizations. So obviously, FCC is thinking here, how can they foster collaboration? How can they get in front of some of the challenges that actually face that by working with industry to improve the circumstances? And when you get to the study questions, or when I get to the study questions on the next slide, you'll see a bit about how they're thinking about having us try to help in that regard. And then the other is that you'll see a lot of here is the FCC trying to have us help them figure out how to get in front of this, so that we're not, primarily, unfortunately, what we see in the papers and what we know of is primarily a reactive kind of thing. And so the question is, how can we intrinsically make hardware, software products less susceptible, I'll say, to cyber attack, both from not only how they're built, manufactured, designed, and deployed, but also even pushing back into academia. So how can we get a greater focus in the academic environment so that there's a heightened amount of research and development around this space, because ultimately we know that feeds industry, and industry derives most of its significant advances from that area. So I think it's very, very foresightful of the FCC to encourage us to push back into that space, because that's where a lot of the groundwork can actually be done. And as far as I know, while academia is consulted in a lot of the other activities that are sort of parallel to this, I don't know of anybody that's suggested that we take quite that tack, which is to try to, no pun intended, get in front of this with academia to try to influence them, to try to influence the problem. So that's, in a nutshell, I think what's encapsulated in the mission statement that the FCC provided here. And then they gave us a series of study questions, also illegible. So I really would not want to take a course under Jeff because he had a lot of study questions here. But again, several things here. You'll see the first one refers to the supply chain paradigm. So how can supply resiliency be improved? I can tell you that that's never more challenging than now, because if you think about how most things are physically manufactured today, most items that involve security, especially if it's a self-contained entity, usually always start with a hardware root of trust. And a hardware root of trust is not easily identified, especially in today's manufacturing world. And that problem can be much, much more complicated when one thinks about the supply chain and how things are built and ultimately constructed. So that's kind of what the first one is getting at. We talked a little bit about design and development. How can we fundamentally influence the design and development of content from industry so that it can be intrinsically more secure at its outset? Industry, I can tell you, coming from it, is heavily focused on this area. There is kind of a perception that security is an afterthought. Traditionally, I would say years ago, it was do as little as you could do to get away with in order to get your product to market. That has changed quite a lot. The stakes are much, much higher now. So it's not quite as not nearly the afterthought that it used to be, but still, there's probably more that can be done here. Stakeholders, obviously, as I mentioned before, the supply chain, the food chain for how products get built are increasingly more complex, and the ability to actually trace, the rigid security and to thread that through the manufactured product is increasingly challenging. How do we actually thread processes together that allow open sharing? So that theme continues to reemerge, sharing of threat vectors, of remedial actions, and I can tell you that is a focus of other agencies in this same vicinity as well. It's how to get industry, government to collaborate and share both horizontally and, I guess, sort of vertically, if you will. And that's not something that's easily and naturally done among competitors in an environment, but we've run into that the last couple of years, and I suspect we'll be recasting one of our recommendations in that regard. And of course, some of these start to repeat a little bit, but then we start to get into technical measures. How can those actually be instituted? And of course, then back to the point about getting back in the food chain so that there's an enhanced R&D activity around this from the very beginning, back in academia and where the universities and the fundamental research can actually be done. So when I thought about this, I kind of netted it out to these kind of three areas, with a little bit of help and counsel from Jeff and Lauren. So the first thing is to analyze the ecosystem and try to identify the standards that most people are paying the most attention to. The activity just last year on cloud security told us that there's a plethora is probably an understatement, a boatload, maybe I'll try that term, of standard activities in the security arena alone. And so then the real question becomes, well, what are the most relevant ones? What are industry paying attention to and building to? So to try to winnow the list down so that you get the most leverage. And then industry best practices, and increasingly those exist, but increasingly the stakes are higher and the game gets much, much more difficult. The second one I think is really very important as well. It's a bit reactive, but it doesn't have to be. Typically people think about threat sharing as a reactive kind of measure. Threat is detected by carrier X or by enterprise Y or by government agency Z. How can I tell people what I've experienced so that they don't experience the same thing? That's a reactive kind of thing. But increasingly we're seeing the opportunity to actually have best practice sharing. So I'd like to think that we can hook these two items together so that we're not just sharing remediation, but we're actually sharing best practices at a rudimentary level that doesn't trigger competitive issues. And this has always been a place where I felt that the FCC could play a major role, which is in brokering that sharing environment in a non-threatening, non-collusive manner, which doesn't normally happen in industry on its own volition. And then finally, looking for, and I chose the words means to influence the hardware and software suppliers. Influence is probably the wrong word. Maybe coerce is a better word. But try to convince the hardware and software suppliers that this is very important and to push it back up in their food chain. And as I alluded to earlier, this is speaking purely from the perspective of Motorola, not a lot of coercion is required. The stakes are just far too high. The world is just, the threats are just too complex now. So I think, we certainly as a company welcome the opportunity to share the wisdom with other members of the TAC and other members that we can pull in. Appreciate the FCC bringing attention to this in such a public way, in its unique avenue as well. So I think a big part of the task here will be getting the FCC hooked up with, and vice versa, other activities that are going on, that I know are going on, that I know my work colleagues will know that are going on, and then how to make 1 + 1 = 3. And then the final slide I had was just simply the membership that's still constructing, and I was taking active notes here. As I'd mentioned, Jeff is our liaison with some help from Lauren, And then this was the list of potential members that I'd gotten, which is, again, as I'd mentioned, largely a reconstitution of last year's cloud security group. There were a few other folks on here that we thought would be very good contributors to this. So if your name is up here, you might consider yourself to be under active recruitment, maybe is a polite way to actually put it. And I'll be in touch with you folks. Dennis, I didn't lay out a plan here because we haven't convened the group yet, and I thought it'd be kind of inappropriate to actually lay out a plan with specific deliverables that the group hadn't had a chance to actually contribute to and shape and buy into. So with this, we'll get after that within the next few weeks and come back to you with some details.
I'm actually very disappointed with your term of coercion. I thought you would be quite...
Without what now? I'm sorry, you said what?
No, with your coercion, I thought you'd have a whole plan laid out and then coerce your group into...
No, that's not usually my style. So we'll actually get together and see if we can work up a plan. We were thinking that what would happen was we would continue. We left several things undone with cloud security last year, so we were thinking that we would probably roll that forward. There's work here that we will certainly leverage, but this is actually a much broader swing at the problem of security. So first task would be to get our arms around that and what we can accomplish in basically a year's time. Okay?
No, as I started, it is a critical area. This is your opportunity for Ish, you're on.
I think this is a really important area to explore and to investigate, and I'm wondering if the charter is going to accommodate, beyond, the confidentiality, authentication, more on the data integrity side, which is, I think, not something that's gotten the focus it should. I think it might have bled out of maybe the cloud security work group, but if I look at data integrity and ensuring the immutability of data as something that needs to intrinsically be looked at, especially with data analytics and cloud becoming more and more to the front. Are those things that you're going to look at?
Thanks for the input. Definitely, I think those would be under consideration. And you're right, that actually did come up with the cloud security work last year. And interesting connection, though, is more and more decisions in life is driven off of data analytics that takes particular importance, not just the traditional, is my bank account accurate and correct?
I think even more so when you look at virtualized instances of things, chain of custody for data is going to become more and more important, especially at the enterprise level. And I'm not sure that we've got a good hold of that in the industry yet.
Thanks.
Jesse?
Thanks, Dennis. Paul, one of the things that I know, Dick, I guess when we first got started, major issues have been raised about this prior to the original group getting formed. In terms of sources of threats. We tend to think about threats being originated from networks or other networks attacking, particularly in the enterprise space, attacking the new emerging wireless networks in the enterprise space. But now we're beginning to get more increasingly concerned with devices being sources of threats. And I know Dick and I had pretty rich debate quite a while back about how do you do security scans, security control of devices, because the nature of these devices are changing rapidly, as you obviously know. So my question was, in the section where identifying mechanisms and industry sharing, is there a possibility for us to start to explore how do we really manage with bring your own device and all those kinds of things that are happening with these new tablets and smartphones? Should we now start to look at how do we manage security of these devices, because the trend seems to be they're being decoupled from the network, and what are the ramifications of decoupling these devices from the network, given the rich computing power of these devices and the potential of them injecting threats into the network?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's certainly someplace where my company's spending a lot of time thinking about devices that are not purpose-built from the ground up, but need to interact in what's otherwise a secure domain, whether it's the enterprise bring your own devices you talked about to a retail or a T&L agency, or whether it's actually the federal government trying to leverage commercial devices in a secure way as well. So that's something we have some reasonable experience with. The real trick is how do you take what still involves some specialization of either the hardware and or software environment. It comes back again to that hardware root of trust so that you know what you booted ultimately. How do you minimize that specialization required so that consumers can actually benefit from that? That's one. Two, I thought where you were going, and this might be a plug for IoT thing 3.5 or something like that. I think another threat. Okay. Because I think another significant threat is actually not people with devices, but it's the devices themselves, and that can be malinfluenced themselves. So as important as individuals being authenticated are the physical devices themselves. We typically think of human credentials, but I think increasingly device credentials are going to be very important as well. Thanks for the comment.
Russ?
Got a couple points I'd like to make. And I brought this up last year. When we talk about software and hardware vendors, I think we need to be careful again not to impose anything on U.S. specific that would stifle innovation. So that's a global community. So I don't know if there's a way to reach out from a global perspective on hardware and software when you start to focus on some of these areas. Second point, there's a pretty big government, I should say Obama administration effort on cybersecurity you're probably aware of. Is there any way to leverage some of that so there's not duplicate efforts? I'll put it that.
Yeah, I think thanks for that second.
And then I got just a couple more points. The other one is
this is a multi-part.
It is. There's other government agencies very active in this space. The FTC is fairly active. There was a good piece on 60 Minutes last night. In fact, I think to one of the points earlier about the mobile devices, not just the devices but the apps, that people were basically opening the door. There's security is just nobody knows. I'll put it that way, or cares maybe. And then the last point, the IoT perspective. We definitely want a liaison with your team because security, when you talk to anybody about IoT in the industry, the biggest concern is IoT security. In fact, one of the big retailers that had the data breach was from a device that was not suspectable as being hacked. So just some areas. Sorry, there were 4 points, not 2.
That's all right. You're signed up, my friend.
Did you have any?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think he just restated, I think, what I was trying to say up front, which is one of the big challenges is to avoid the duplicative, activity. So, I mean, sorting through all that.
See, Russ, that was the word, duplicative.
He got it.
Just didn't flow.
Yeah. So that is going to be a challenge. There's so much attention on this now. Thanks.
And I think I don't see any more cards. I think I'll okay, go ahead, Kevin.
Just a quick scope question. Paul, you sort of started to address it at one point, but a couple of years ago we focused on wireless infrastructure and devices and apps, and then last year focused on cloud. And of course, cybersecurity is so broad. Any thoughts on what scope you'll emphasize for this year's work?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think my thought would be we're going to have to iterate on that with the FCC a bit, to be honest with you, because it is just huge. So my thinking is to pool the expertise, and so I would like to get a fairly large cross-section of this team, at least advising, if not actively, creating content. I'd like to try to get an inventory of everything that we know of, those standards and/or industry initiatives that could intersect with this, and then try to use that to kind of, as you suggest, build up sort of what's the slice through that maybe makes the most sense for the FCC to try to have an impact on. I have several different thoughts in my head, but I kind of want to bat them around with the work group before I get too far. My natural bias would be, maybe toward emergency preparedness systems and emergency communication systems and public safety, but that might be a little too narrow.
So it's kind of an approach of looking for fat rabbits.
Yeah.
Profitable areas.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes. Yes. Paul?
Yeah, Harold.
One of the things that I know you mentioned, and I know it's very important, is this collaborative discussion between not only service providers but the enterprise as well, since large networks originate in the enterprise as well. So one of the things that I think would be of great importance is, because today so much of it is ad hoc, meaning my security team knows people from other security teams, but it's very almost clandestine in some ways because nobody wants to say what's vulnerable and what isn't. So a lot of that, perhaps maybe this is where we can concentrate on something the FCC could help us with, not legislating or forcing, but more of a clearinghouse or perhaps something along those lines, because that tends to be one of the big issues of not just on reacting, but truly being proactive and predictive in the way we look at these problems. And so I just think we ought to add that into our conversation.
Yeah, I put that in the category of the sharing space. I completely agree. I think that's clearly keeps coming up year on year. So.
One of the other set of words that I didn't hear you utter, but I think has to fall into this, is the critical infrastructures, the whole notion of critical infrastructures, which that list keeps being expanded. But this has been something that's been a theme for years. I look back at a personal level, by pure happenstance, I had the opportunity to review the first critical infrastructure review that was done on a commission back in the Clinton era. So it's been around for a long time, even as I've been around for a long time, I suppose. But it's still not in any way resolved. In fact, the number of elements being added to the critical infrastructures and the number of threats from a cyber standpoint just keeps growing. So this seems like it would be an area, at least another dimension to the context for the problem.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Seeing no other tent cards, we will move forward to the Internet of Things, which is probably the flashiest of our 5 topics for the year. It, as you have already, between David and particularly Russ, the Thing 1 and Thing 2, I mean, it also seems to be the most fanciful of our activities, but it is critical. It is one that is exploding before our very eyes. People have been talking about this for a long time in various ways, but it's really happening now, major conferences on this topic and so on. So, exciting group to go forward with. And I'm not sure how Thing 1 and Thing 2 have arranged yourselves.
Thing 1's going to do the presentation. I'll do, we'll alternate by quarter. But I just, as one of the folks that actually likes to throw the wireless dongle, I just wanted to give you a little vision to keep in your minds. If you ever go to give a seminar at IBM Research, what they do is they basically have the wireless mic for speaker, questions afterwards, mounted inside a volleyball.
Ooh.
So I just want to give you that image.
Okay. Slides. There we go. So we're just starting out on this working group, by the way. So at the high level, I thought we were.
Yeah, it looks like a security issue to me.
It's definitely not an IoT problem. It's a security problem. So anyway, what we're looking at is, at a high level, what's the impact of IoT on the network in, for instance, 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years? And I think everybody's aware and has heard about the term IoT. So why is that important? Today, we're connected roughly 5 to 6 billion items to the network today. So by 2020, the expectation is for us to move to, there's different estimates from 20 billion to 50 billion, which I think even 50 billion may be on the low end. A quick look at the working group. This is definitely not comprehensive. I know I've missed a few names, Shahid. As you pointed out earlier, Thing 4. So come see me. I missed Marty earlier, and I've got a couple others that I heard volunteer. So we'll add those to the group. So our charter, and David and I are still, working out the actual details on some of these items, but clearly want to identify key areas in the evolving internet that should drive the work of the Commission in areas where the Commission should seek key information with regard to IoT. Also, the big one again, what demands the Internet of Things, including M2M, which is machine-to-machine, will place on the network. Also, what technology policies exist in the evolution towards the Internet of Things, and look for ways where the FCC can foster IoT innovation. When we talk about 50 billion devices, there's a great deal of innovation both on the wireless side as well as the network side that will probably come out of this. Key areas of focus for us. So we'll start off with sort of the big picture of why IoT, what are the social and economic benefits in terms of why it's important for us to even focus on that, to sell it within the organization of the FCC. Look at the data growth, the number of devices, what that impact will be. Today, many people look at IoT as very small amounts of data, but small amounts of data times 50 billion adds up to lots of data. IoT security, spoofing, device vulnerability. I gave an example earlier of some of those issues. I think those will just be more and more in the press over the next couple of years as people learn to hack into IoT devices, unfortunately. IoT data privacy is another big one. Spectrum challenges and opportunities. We need to take a look at what type of spectrum will be required, whether there's any type of interferers from private deployments, things like that. Public safety opportunities. There may be some really great options here to enhance public safety with Internet of Things. Also explore some of the business models, implications for the net, blockers, et cetera, and take a look at standards and best practices as it applies to Internet of Things. So this next slide is sort of the example taxonomy. This is the Uber taxonomy, and you probably can't see this. It sort of looks like a phoenix almost, or something, some type of bird with wings.
Paul's charts is?
Yes, it is. It's one of Paul's charts. In any case, this one's kind of interesting because it just shows the breadth of every market this touches, whether it's energy, consumer, healthcare, industrial, transportation, retail, public sector, or public safety and buildings, IoT and networks. And then it's got, this one particular has 4 different really tech stacks in terms of services, applications, location, devices. What we're going to do, one of the first things is build a taxonomy that's focused on IoT per the FCC and what the FCC would be interested in. So just some of the external organizations we do plan to leverage. This is not comprehensive. Each one of these organizations or groups are taking a leadership role. One of those government agencies, FTC, would like to learn a little bit more what they're doing as well and how it impacts what we're doing. We don't want to duplicate what they're doing, but we also want to leverage that. Other standards groups, IEEE, IETF, 1M2M, et cetera, are all leading some of the efforts around standards, around networking of IoT devices. And then our work plan, we're definitely going to leverage the past work. There's been a great deal of leadership around IoT provided by Shahid in the last working group efforts, and Shahid is part of the team, so we're glad and looking forward to that debrief. Again, the taxonomy and matrix, do some fact-finding on forecast use cases and business models, and then looking at what's inevitable in the market and what potential influence there could be from the TAC itself or the FCC. We'll proprietarize and scope the activities within the context of the FCC. Again, we need to keep doing this within the context of the FCC. IoT is a very large area. Deep dives on key opportunities and challenges, and we'll have an initial list of opportunities and some proposed recommendations, actionable recommendations by December. So just from a logistical standpoint, and again, we're still forming the group. We're seeking a few other key members that we feel are big players in IoT, but we'll most likely have weekly team meetings. We may do biweekly. It depends on how that works out. Create some sub-teams or subgroups within the working group. Reach out to the industry SMEs, standards organizations, as well as work with our FCC advisor. And we'll also look at how to build that liaison with some of the government agencies. We do hope to have a draft list of recommendations just to get some feedback and some, kick the tires from the rest of the TAC by June. So that's basically where we sit today, and open for feedback and comments.
Kevin.
Oh, we are, okay. So Russ, are you guys going to circle back to kind of the perennial licensed, unlicensed debate on spectrum? I mean, it seems like, we kind of went through everybody's unlicensed for a while, and then we kind of got some sanity and everybody's licensed, and that was a focus. And this strikes me as going to take us back toward unlicensed in a heavier way, because if you're really talking about 50 billion and up devices, the only way that's going to happen is with a certain amount of self-organization, and individual licensing of devices is probably going to be too awkward. So there's going to have to be some facilitation there. And I'm just wondering, does this reopen that discussion, and will it get covered by your group or somewhere else?
So it's a good point. I think it's one of those things we'll take a look at when we build the taxonomy, as well as what we plan to tackle within this group. Keep in mind, too, a lot of these IoT devices that will connect to the network will be connecting in homes and businesses to private, networks or through a service provider. So hopefully there's not as big of an issue on the unlicensed, but it's definitely an area we need to take a deep dive on.
Well, I'm mostly concerned with if we can get some kind of estimate on whether we are actually going to wind up significantly increasing the pressure on unlicensed spectrum, therefore putting more of an urgent requirement on, where we go next on that side of the fence, because I think that's been, more
that's
or less
in our
under control
scoping.
within the Wi-Fi space. It's kind of settled itself, at least for the moment, although everybody'd always like to see more. It's not, it's not a crisis most places, but this could turn it back into that, is all I'm trying to say.
I think this is part of the desire to get, a taxonomy, not at necessarily the detailed level, but break down the big chunks so we can look at that question chunk by chunk and say, okay, there's kind of a consumer piece. How's that going to be addressed spectrum-wise? There's going to be, what you might think of as public spaces. How's that going to be addressed? There's industrial, but within confined, spaces.
Yeah, I mean,
so try to get it into like 4 or 5 chunks.
Just, kind of generic unlicensed or generic licensed. They're going to be subgroupings, and so if you can address that, that would I think be
I
good.
think not break it into 100, but if we can break it into sort of, literally a handful. Then we can, I think, probably get more, kind of better insights than if we try to look at the whole question, because it's just not, there are many different flavors of IoT.
Brian?
Thank you. This is a good, timely topic in the wireless industry, because one of the areas of research right now is looking at 5G and what is 5G. And the biggest driver for that is the Internet of Things and machine-to-machine, one of the biggest drivers, I should say. Recently at the Mobile World Congress, there was an announcement that NGNM, the Next Generation Mobile Networks Group, is developing a paper this year. There's 4G Americas is looking at this topic, and a number of standards organizations. There's heavy investment out of Europe in 5G, when we look at Internet of Things, we're looking at various things. Spectrum comes into play, looking at millimeter wave, up in the millimeter wave bands, looking at various degrees of mobility, everything from non-mobile to mobile, new network architectures to handle these type of devices, including network function virtualization and software-defined networks. So certainly is a lot of area, and this is a good, timely topic, especially with the research that's going on outside the U.S., that looking at it here in the U.S.
Great. John?
Yes, I was curious about your interest in finding a sort of FCC slice in this space, and the reason is because I'm concerned about potential fragmentation. If we were to think about, say, an alert light or a temperature sensor, it's sort of the same kind of hardware, but if I plug it into the public internet, it's an FCC concern. If I plug it into a medical body area network because it's inside me, it's a FDA concern. If it's in an aircraft, it's a FAA concern. If it's on a building and it might be fire relevant, it's the local fire code. I think it would be great to think about how we can figure out ways of avoiding that kind of fragmentation and finding solutions that can cross all of those spaces, because otherwise you've got markets and technology and regulations going in 50 different directions.
I think it's a good point. I brought up, just for instance, the FTC is one of the other regulatory agencies, but you bring up quite a few of the other ones. And that's one of the challenges. I think we're seeing more and more gray areas as devices start to connect. How you plug in your Fitbit, for instance, is it plugged into your medical provider? Is it plugged into your service provider? I think there's all these different plays of who has sort of the authority or the responsibility in the end.
Adam?
So that might be another taxonomy we have to do as well.
Actually, sort of a riff off the spectrum comment. If I look at today's pressure for bandwidth, One of the questions is if you have the growth of the Internet of Things, and I see projections that that'll actually exceed the traffic that you have for video, voice, or existing data. In fact, what kind of networks should that traffic go on? Okay, is it things that are tuned for video, or is it things that are tuned for something else, essentially? Okay? And so I would say, how do you reserve and make sure that there is enough bandwidth, that it's the appropriate kind of bandwidth that will actually support this, and that is, where in the spectrum you're going to pick it. And then lastly, what are the economics models that will be attached to this piece of spectrum? And is it better to go licensed or unlicensed? I think these are all issues that are actually fairly important if you're going to have wide-scale deployment.
Great.
So I hope we address some of those.
Yeah, do you want to respond?
It is something we need to look at. Again, I think dividing up by area, but also looking at the different traffic patterns, because I think what we're going to find is that there's at least a bimodal, and it's probably a more complicated distribution of traffic patterns. An enormous number of devices that are very low amounts of data per device. But you'll also probably have an enormous number of devices that, have either video cameras or the moral equivalent to video cameras, image-like sensors. So I think it's one of the things we need to get input on. That's why there's an early data collection phase. Try to get an understanding of, the approximate types of buckets. But we should expect a range of traffic patterns. So it's not going to be quite as simple as this is the pattern. Let's find spectrum for that kind of pattern.
In fact, David, my feeling is we don't know what the patterns are going to be.
Right, and we should expect it to evolve.
Yeah.
Great. Harold?
Yes, just a couple comments. One was to Adam's point about call it bandwidth allocation for the Internet of Things versus other critical services, and looking for, I would imagine you'll have to talk about classes of service and how we either create new ones or ban them, et cetera. The other one had to do with, we've had a conversation here in the past about IPv6 and the migration and the encouragement of said. And as we know, many of us know, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but there still is a less than creeping move to IPv6. Even though you'll see it listed, we still see a lot of significant amount of IPv4 traffic. And so I would hope that that's also one of the encouragements is to adopting and moving further along to handle the many undecillion devices that will be supported at some point. So.
Great. Gee, do you know anything about this subject?
No.
Having chaired last year's related topic.
So 2 years ago when we did this, we spoke to a number of different companies. We held a workshop at CTIA where we had, I think, not only just the carriers but everybody from Nest at the time through auto car manufacturers, utility companies, and so forth. The underlying summary here is that I think most companies or the market in general said, look, I don't think we need a lot of regulation for that matter. We don't need to sort out the interoperability issues. We'll get that. That's already kind of happening organically. But what is needed, I thought I heard, was consumer awareness of the data that your garage opener that you use every day on your iPhone, where's that data go? Or for that matter, the thermostat analytics, what happens to all those personal data for the consumer? And so what I heard was, and Henning, you were there too, was the consumer awareness angle. And I think that's where FCC can play a significant role in assuring that there are some structures, disciplines associated with maintaining and protecting data, and B, putting the right type of framework for companies to enable this protection. Anyway, I mean, that's something that, I thought was the outcome, the effort we did about 2 years ago.
Great. Jesse?
Thanks, Dennis. I just wanted to go back to a point that Paul and I was talking about earlier, is that if you look at these devices, and Kevin really put his finger on it, is that with these programmable RF front ends that we're moving toward on these devices, you're not going to be able to know whether a device is a unlicensed-based platform device or a license-based platform device, because it's going to be able to do both. And it really raises the question back that Paul and I were talking about, is how do you protect the network from these types of devices, because we're giving them multiple avenues to inject threats into the network. So I think doing this taxonomy, Russ, that you and Dave was talking about, I think you really need to look at the implication of this IoT from a device perspective as well, in terms of what needs to be done to categorize all of these devices from a radio point of view or from a spectrum point of view.
Great. Glenn?
One of the things I was going to comment along the lines of what Shahid was talking about, in our machine-to-machine working group, there were a couple of other points. One was the IPv6 point that Harold had mentioned. That's going to be fundamental and key, and I completely agree. We're approaching that in a creep-like fashion. We're not being very aggressive, or probably as aggressive as we need to be. But one of the other areas that compounds the problem is the fact that there are actually lots of machine-to-machine devices that reside on what we would think of as legacy spectrum, right? One of the conversations that we had was with, I can't remember the company where you know, if your car has a problem and it will announce something. I mean, it's all on 2G spectrum. And so there's E164 addressing problems. There's how do you force the migration? How do you go through bandwidth reclamation or spectrum reclamation? There's a whole series of things that will have to be considered in this. And not to make a broad topic broader, but somehow or another, I think we're going to have to go the other way and try to find a way to scope this in a reasonable and measurable way.
Arvid, yeah.
I just want to go back to the subject of traffic patterns and network design. Because of the dominance today of video delivery, the network is moving to an architecture with very deep caching and asymmetric bandwidth. And the Internet of Things is going to be much more uploading, and it's going to have potentially very significant implications.
Great. Milo.
Yeah, I think the previous conversation about licensed versus unlicensed just reminds me of the conversation we had in PCAST, which was, you know, I worry about a different kind of fragmentation, which is this band is for this piece of spectrum is for that, this piece of spectrum is for that, and we're not allowing services to flow across different uses. We, you know, in PCAST talked about not licensed versus unlicensed, but protected versus non-protected. And I think those kind of frameworks where you have an intermediary to deconflict use in a particular of spectrum in a particular place or under certain circumstances could be helpful in this model. Because I think it's not a black or white, and I think if we start fragmenting spectrum, which is already pretty darn fragmented even more, we're going backwards in spectrum policy, not forwards. So I think we need to try and find ways of the Internet of Things to get along, that gets along in a more broader framework and not in its own.
Okay, Kevin.
Yeah, just a quick comment. We talk a lot in the context of the number of devices and the impact on spectrum and whether spectrum, you know, would be reserved or whatever for this. And the other dimension I think we want to make sure to include when we think about spectrum is also, you know, just the spatial reuse of that spectrum. So, you know, the alternatives for maybe using some of the spectrum to very high gain by very high levels of spatial reuse with smaller and smaller cells at the edge.
What an amazing lead into Marty. Spatial reuse. Marty, please.
Complicate the definition of what the Internet of Things is. I just want to point out that
a large proportion of the things that we are talking about are devices that are carried on the person. And I think those have to be considered part of what this committee is looking at. We keep calling this device that we carry a cell phone, and I never understood why they keep hanging on to this archaic name of phone, when really what this device is a server that has the capability of all kinds of inputs, and many of these inputs are going to be medical devices, and maybe a phone will be one of the inputs.
I'd be careful not to get hung up into the licensed, unlicensed debate, because I think this is an area where there's synergy already, and I expect that to happen. Some of the things to think about, though, and I think we've been touching on it, so far most of the Internet of Things devices have been relatively low bandwidth, short bursts, but suppose that changes. What's the impact on all sorts of networks, whether they be wireless or connection, even to the Internet? If you could imagine Captain Kirk telling Bones, could you please check the patients with your tricorder, and he says, I haven't got the bandwidth for it. And just thinking about Marty's comment, I mean, we're not really that far away from these sorts of things, and the expansion of video, and what is that going to do? And the last point I'd make is when we talk about recommendations back to the FCC, don't equate it to regulation. Some of these may be things even for the community as well. Whether it's, hey, good practice in this area means do the processing at the endpoints and send as little information as you can, and shining light on those sorts of things. So I'm glad that this is a topic nobody is interested in.
Yes, right.
It should be a real exciting and interesting group.
A quick comment to that. So I think you're right. What we see today from most Internet of Things are low bandwidth, low data. But just look at the cost curves of CPU and compute, Raspberry Pis, for instance. That's going to have an impact on how intelligent devices are. And to a point earlier, I do think when most people think of IoT, they think of just send it. There's no hold time, there's no caching, so to speak. So that might be one of those best practices that comes out of this, is how to manage that better at the edge even. But I do think we're going to see a lot more intelligent, higher data things coming out over the next few years. And wearables are definitely going to be a part of that. I call them wearables, whether it's a Band-Aid type app, thing that checks your pulse temperature, whatever. Those are all things. So these are just some of the 50 billion areas. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. And thanks for the advice on spectrum, by the way. We'll try not to dive too deep into that debate. Fred?
Yeah, just one other thought, not to pile on too much, but I think we've got some serious public safety issues to consider here. What happens in a highly connected environment when there's a natural disaster? And how do you prioritize maybe medical-related traffic over, 100 Fitbits that are trying to all signal they're in trouble? So I think we got some real issues to look at there. We also need to think forward beyond just the sensor model, and one where the devices become controllable. What happens when we can manage our cars or public infrastructure through these models, and what does that mean?
And that is all happens.
Yeah, exactly.
Shahid, did you have another, or you're?
Oh, no, this is.
Okay, that's.
Are you implying, though, that if my Fitbit can't communicate, that's not an emergency?
Depends on the situation, right? I mean, we literally have a possibility where we could have millions of these devices trying to do semi-critical to critical stuff at once in a very difficult situation, and we should think a little bit ahead about how we're going to prioritize that.
No, you can imagine a natural disaster, everything lighting up, and what does that do? David?
I think this will go back partly to the taxonomy. Partly what I think the group's alerted here is the best practice thing, right, which can have to do with how devices could, a best practice, for example, can be how you hold on to information and, send later when necessary, which we do on the internet all the time.
There is huge precedent, though, for giving priority to public interest things like first responders and so on. So there's some of those criteria may carry forward here.
And you'll notice in the charts were necessarily abbreviated, but we sort of tried to flag some of these things having to do with KIPP, having to do with public safety. We also think there's some great public safety opportunities. Some opportunities to rethink and do things differently and better. So, again, it'll probably start from a taxonomy and then we want to get different groups digging into these parts. So we'll do some divide and conquer.
Use case work, that was further down on the list, is also probably a good place to look at that issue a little bit.
Definitely.
Yeah, and some of your taxonomy, again, whether public safety cameras are truly things or not truly things, and how you build that. That's
my car could be a thing.
Yes. Well, no, your car is probably many things.
So a lot of different flavors.
Yeah.
And one of the things I did want to call out, Russ mentioned trying to make sure that we're aware of the work of other groups. So folks could please, I think folks in this committee overall probably have a lot of awareness. My experience is you try to make these lists. Even though Russ and I tried, I noticed just the other day that apparently the NSTAC is spinning up a working group or a subcommittee on this topic. So it would make a lot of sense to coordinate with them. I'm guessing that somebody in this room is probably involved with that. So where you're involved with activities or you're on a committee that's also spinning up a parallel activity, I think, trying to get as much coordination as we can, particularly the government-related activities, would be very useful.
Great. Marty, back to you.
Commented on this Pandora's box that Julie just opened. Somehow, whenever we talk about unlicensed spectrum, there's a presumption that you can use any technique you want or any kind of interface. The bottom line is any spectrum ought to be used in a spectrally efficient way. And as soon as when we talk about the future of unlicensed spectrum, we've got to be doing something about establishing rules about how effectively you transmit, in addition to doing the things that Julie talked about, where you send as little information as possible. So unlicensed does not mean unregulated.
Good. Okay, as Julie already said, it's terrific to have a topic that has so little interest. No, I think this would be a very exciting topic, and certainly it underscores the linkage, and I think it's already mentioned, the linkage between the different groups, and certainly there is a lot of intertwining. But let's move on to
and feel free to contact David or I to participate. So thanks again. Lots of great feedback.
Still recruiting.
We've got a lot of work.
Russ was very effective, for those of you who recall, in last time around recruiting. I think you did have the largest group last time around as well.
Not that we're keeping track of that sort of thing.
All right, very good. Advanced sharing, which has just gone to sleep on Walter's on his computer. So, Brian, you're...
I need the stall.
Russ. So this is why I'm not sure who moved you, Russ. You were right there sitting next to Dave. So I had this vision of this perfect boom, boom, boom down the line.
It's a very dynamic world, Dennis.
Yes, it is. It is.
See myself in infinity view on the camera.
Okay, this is the report of the Advanced Sharing and Enabling Wireless Technologies Working Group. It's being co-led by Ed Chan of Verizon and myself. The charter was
terrific, by the way, to see Verizon and AT&T working so closely together.
But the sharing part is
in the sharing part.
In sharing, yeah, in sharing.
I have
You know how many of us are biting our tongue?
I obviously couldn't.
We could just call this the sharing part.
Now that we've totally derailed you, Brian,
well, let's
please
go back
continue.
to the charter of the group now. There's really 3 points to the charter of the group. First is to look at an advanced sharing framework, and that's really to enhance spectrum efficiency while protecting the incumbent services, including both federal and non-federal services. Identify and evaluate enabling technologies which will enhance sharing efficiency, looking at requirements for the protection of incumbent services and also to encourage coexistence of federal and non-federal systems. And finally, to look at recommendations regarding the establishment and objectives of the RF Model City, where the proposed advanced sharing framework and enabling technologies can be tested and evaluated. The working group members, the co-chairs are listed there, and our FCC liaisons. We have a number of volunteers for the working group already. We did hold one call last Thursday to kick things off and present the slides that we are given here today. Let's talk about the advanced sharing first. There was a recommendation coming out of this CSMAC that framework to share the AWS-3 bands between federal and non-federal operations. And the current framework is static and generated fixed circles for protection and coordination zones. We're looking at what the Commission has adopted or is in discussion on more dynamic sharing schemes and other bands, including the white space TV bands, 3.5 gig, 5 gig, and the 70, 80, 90 gigahertz bands. The advanced sharing may encompass currently proposed sharing schemes or their combination with other enabling technologies that the working group is going to set out to explore. Some of those enabling technologies include interference detection and cancellation, advanced antennas and beamforming, time-space frequency coordination, centralized spectrum database management and signaling, device-based or infrastructure-based sensing technologies, and perhaps infrastructure and RAN sharing. The working group is going to identify leading companies on these enabling technologies and solicit their feedback to provide their input on how these technologies may help with this task. Some of the systems under consideration include commercial, federal, and various frequency bands. In the commercial side, looking at fixed and terrestrial as well as satellite. The federal systems looking at airborne, radar, fixed and terrestrial, satellite and passive systems. And the initial focus is going to be on frequency bands under 10 gigahertz, but there may be some other specific bands of interest that the working group may identify looking at various sharing scenarios, systems, and frequency bands. The PCAST report introduced the model, the concept of a test city. And Appendix G of the report talks about creation of the test city complemented by a mobile test service to support rapid experimentation and gain operational test data. The working group is going to provide recommendations on key areas of the model city creation, including what the scope and definition of the RF model city should be, logistics on the model city, such as location, systems involved, frequency bands, operational constraints, and timelines, phases, and objectives. And finally, any sharing technologies to be considered in the RF model city. The key milestones we're shooting towards for the June meeting, we want to identify the areas and technologies of focus for advanced sharing, participate in the discussion for RF model cities, and also develop a white paper on the current sharing models. For September, we're going to recommend the top technical operational policy directions and changes to facilitate advanced sharing of federal and non-federal frequency bands, and also continue with the RF model city discussion. And finally, in December, provide specific recommendations on the framework for advanced sharing, and also recommendations which may include the strategic fit in the RF model city. That concludes the presentation and introduction.
All right, very good. Thank you, Brian. Marty, is yours up for comment now, or was this your TED card? Okay, no. Are there comments? Dale.
Well, I can't help but indicate that
we're doing a lot of work, of course, on the enforcement area. So I think it's pretty clear that we need to coordinate between what you're doing in terms of coming up with the advanced sharing sort of models and what we need to be thinking about in terms of enforcement. I think pretty obvious, but it's clear we'll need to coordinate, I think.
Brian, do you plan to include sort of like QoS or quality of service prioritization, and how real time do you think this can be?
I think those potentially could fall under some of the enabling technologies for sharing, looking at some of those parameters and determining whether or not,
The reason I ask is, back to the point that was made earlier about first responders, when we've done the analysis, when something bad happens in a fairly localized area, they need a lot in a hurry, but they don't need a lot everywhere.
Right.
But the problem is you never know where they're going to need it.
Right.
Other comments? It's always the interesting one. Oh, okay. Please.
I would also say, one of the interesting dynamics here is we don't really have too many single band only devices anymore. And when you think about how things change when you've got devices that can talk to multiple bands, and be able to be agile, how that informs sharing, right? What you can do with sharing, because it's no longer the case that access to the shared spectrum is, if you lose all access to it, you're out of luck, right? There are it becomes an optimization. And I think that's really something that when we look at sharing in general, as we think about different use models, we need to keep in mind.
Great. The interesting feature of this working group, the last one, clearly the tent cards lit up with the Internet of Things. It turns out with all of the, Milo talked about the PCAST report, or mentioned it earlier, the PCAST, the President's various memos, the activity level, I think, between the FCC and the NTIA and Department of Defense and others, this probably is our highest profile activity in that space. So it is one that we need to be heavily focused on. So, Kevin, you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to make a follow-up comment to Milo's, that I think there are a lot of technologies now provide a lot of software controls and things that will provide a lot more flexible ways of doing sharing. And I think exactly what you're referring to, the idea of being, maybe there's some spectrum dedicated to more reliable coverage, and there's other spectrum that you target specifically at more elastic capacity at very large volumes, and that kind of those two could play really well together, and again feeds into the spatial reuse aspect and for the latter one. So.
Okay, final go around. No more tent cards. Let's move on into our final topic, and Nomi's cleanup hitter today. Please.
Thanks, Dennis. Oh, are you pulling up the slides?
You're on. Transition
I'm on?
to IP. You're
okay.
on.
I'm on there.
As soon as.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So, our mission for 2014, and these are the ones. Oh, sorry. Thanks, everyone. This is our mission for 2014. These are the ones that were tasked to us by the FCC. So I won't read these, but rather go through them in the slides. They kind of come up in the slides, and all of you got these on email beforehand. So I'm gonna jump in a little bit to first providing a working group backgrounder. Many of you were here when this effort really first started kicking off. I think it was originally called the PSTN transition, and this came out of the TAC. I think it was our very first brainstorming meeting when we were talking about what could we do that would help accelerate our country in innovation and in job creation. And this group thought about, it came to the conclusion that we should accelerate the transition of the PSTN. So that was really a declaration of this group and Tom Wheeler, and so the vision came out of this group. So now we are here to finish that job. So that's what this working group is going to do. And our thinking is, and we have not yet met. So I should say that that right now this is the thinking of a few people whom I've spoken with before the meeting, and the prior groups, and we'll form our opinion as a group. But the concept that I would suggest for us all to consider, and I'd like to talk about this some today, is to take this working group and frame it as where we're going rather than what we're leaving behind. To think about how we want our networks to evolve, our networks here in our country. And admittedly, this is a very delicate topic. We want to evolve while meeting still what the Commission has defined as mandatory conditions, things like 911 functioning or continued access for persons with disabilities. I think that, clearly, and this has been said by many other people in this meeting today, in other working groups, the world is moving in this direction. And it's really, this kind of transition is really already happening in other parts of the world. And we don't want to be left behind. We want to try to think about what we can do to move this ahead, faster. If this is something that's going to be good for our country tomorrow, why not move it along faster to today? So I think that's really the challenge of this working group. I think the other thing is that really this effort in talking about how we evolve our networks to IP networks, it's really foundational for everything else that's important to many of the other working groups here or to our administration. It's important to things like the Connect to Educate mission, that that mission can only move ahead swiftly if this moves ahead swiftly. And so I think it's a very foundational effort. So our commission has suggested a trial approach since we've last met here. So I thought it was worth putting a slide in here just talking about, well, why a trial approach? What's interesting about that? And as I spoke with people, the thing that I learned is that our government desires to be a learning government, not a command and control government. And I thought that was really wonderful to hear, that these trials are here to help to inform us, and not necessarily to make decisions. It also breaks us from, I'm not sure how many of you have read the book The Innovator's Dilemma, Clayton Christensen's book. It's one of my favorite books. I think about it a lot as a cable company. I think you try to think about, well, how do we make sure that we're not focused on just small increments and small things that we can improve about either the services we provide or the technologies we use, but rather new solutions to the same core questions. And certainly, that's happening in our industry. It's happening in many others here too. So I think that by looking at a trial approach, we kind of break ourselves from, and that's really what Clayton Christensen's premise is that to really break out for something, for a large established organization like the government or like many of our companies, not all, not everybody here represents such a company, but the only way to break out of that is to kind of set aside a separate group that's judged by different rules, different metrics, different rules, and that's the only way an established organization can kind of break out of that dilemma. And so that's really what's trying to be done here with these trials, is that we're saying we're going to allow these new trials and we're giving them a new set of rules. We're not saying you have to live by all of today's rules that the networks do. We're giving them a new set of conditions. So, and the other thing is that we want these trials to remain consumer focused so that we preserve competition, innovation, and public safety. So just thought it was worth putting in a slide about, well, what do we expect from networks? When you kind of boil it all down, what do we want from a network? I think certainly first we want connectivity. And you can think of connectivity in a lot of different ways. I was having a conversation with Peter beforehand, and he spoke about how you could also think about connectivity as ubiquity. That not only might you want to just transition to one IP network, but maybe you want seamless handoff to another IP network. Maybe that's more of what we expect from networks going forward. And actually, Milo, it also ties into the comment you just made a few minutes ago about services flowing between spectrum. Same kind of concept applies there. So connectivity. Second one is we want certain consumer protections, like access for the disabled. I think that's incredibly important for us to always hold as one of the critical mandatory things that we expect. We also want access to, I think maybe it's better called public health and safety, that broader concept. And then last, we want networks to be competitive. We want them to innovate. We want new capabilities that are not possible out of today's environment. We want more capacity. We want more speed, and we want our networks to be intelligent networks that can fuel new capabilities. I think you could also say that we want to maybe as a fifth bullet, possibly you could say that we want a rational economic model for all stakeholders too. So we want to consider how these basic values will transfer over to our new, more capable IP networks. So in the next slides, what I've tried to do, and I would love help from everybody here today, is I tried to take the 6 principles that were on the first slide and tried to turn them into working groups. And so I would love everyone's thoughts, and if we don't solve it all today, we'll solve it in our group, but just how we might break down the working groups. So I've, for now, broken it down into 4 working groups, with the first working group being focused on, so really each of the working groups focuses on one of those core values. So the first one would be focused on consumer protections, how we would examine opportunities for new communication technologies to better serve people with disabilities. And I think certainly there's many wonderful illustrations of how this has already started today. We see technologies like Siri providing improved access or talking guides. But I had a conversation with Henning before the meeting, and he reminded me of how, just as an example, we have a very large need for new IP-based TTY replacement services, as an example. So there are, great needs for new solutions here. I think one of the things that's going to be core to all of our efforts in this working group, and it may even be best called out as a separate working group, I'm not sure, but is, well, what does matter as we look at the impact to customers? What should we measure and report in these trials or with our new networks going forward? So, going back to that Clayton Christensen concept, where he says that the new innovative company really needs to live by a different set of rules. Well, what are the new? How do we want to measure that we're satisfied with the new networks? I think this working group, if this is one of the working groups, it would tap the Commission's Consumer Bureau, which has already done quite a bit of work in this area. The second working group would be about access for public health and safety. We would examine opportunities for improvements in emergency communications. A great example of this is some of the work the Commission's done recently to consider location tracking for cell phones and how that might improve emergency services. So really, we would want this working group to look at new IP-compatible technologies that would change how we would handle emergency situations. And again, we would have to think about how we would measure the effectiveness. And then here also, the CSRIC is already doing a lot of work on this in this area, and we should seek to learn from their work. A great example of some of the things this working group would have to do. I was speaking with Dal about this before the meeting a little. Is that when you in the location tracking matter, how many indoor wireless systems would not be able to to provide some of the information that we might need to look for. So it may involve significant new investment, or we may need to look at new ways to solve providing still that information. Working Group 3 would be focused on competition, innovation, and again, we would look at how we would evolve the new capabilities of networks. We would want to be thinking about that not only are services being replaced, but that they would be replaced by something better. I think one of the tricky things this working group may look at is how is looking at the trade-offs of some of these new technologies. That these new technologies, while bringing wonderful benefits, may often, you rarely realize only benefits without giving up something in a change as well. I think some of the things that we could look at here are innovations stemming from more robust speeds and capacity. And again, we would look at how we would measure the effectiveness of this area. So the last working group would be focused on connectivity and universal access. I think some of those illustrations are ones that are near and dear to many of the people in this room. And again, we'd have to look at a similar conversation about some of the trade-offs that as you use, for example, say satellite technology as a possible practical way to get broadband to rural areas, there would again be trade-offs there too that we would have to look at. So next steps for the TAC work this year would be first to refine and review the working groups together. I'd love to do some of that here today with everyone, or else we'll do it in conversation in the working group. I think we'd have to look at some of these foundational questions, such as how we measure the effectiveness of the trials, how would we make sure that the trials have good experimentation and good technology evaluation rigor. How will we really decide what constitutes success or failure? And we'd have to look at things like what kind of data would need to be collected to support or reject our underlying hypotheses for each of the trials. So we'll want to obviously seek a leader for each of the sub-working groups, whether they're those four or whether we structure them slightly differently, and gather strong working group members. This slide, I inserted the names that were given to me before the meeting, and I think there are already some edits to this slide. I should also mention Henning is our FCC representative right now, and I think we've also added Peter Bloom and Mark. I think you also mentioned, right, that you're in this working group too. And then one other edit, Lynn is, employed by Monty Lee, will be representing NTCA in this working group. Actually, I saw one other edit in this slide. I would just want to apologize to Harold Tietz, right? I think it shouldn't say TWC, it should say TW Telecom. I apologize for that. I should have gotten that right. Yeah. I know that one. So that's it. I'd love to have a little bit of a conversation with everybody, just to learn how you might think we might structure these working groups, and maybe to also to talk a little bit about the measurement issue. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that one as well.
Milo was the first one up.
Okay, great.
So, I remember during the original PSTN report of the TAC, I made the point that I think it's very helpful to have a baseline analysis of how the existing system functions with metrics before you do a transition, to know whether or not you've made things better or worse. And I think it's essential to kind of bring that up again, certainly in the point of these trials, understanding how the existing network functions from a call quality and completion rate, and all the other pieces, underlying pieces of data, are going to be important. And it's not clear that we have all that information about the PSTN in general, but at least in specific areas, it would be really good to have that. Else you're not going to be able to know whether or not you've actually made things better or worse. And that's it.
Know from whence you are leaping, Peter.
Oh, sure.
So Milo and I have known each other for, 15 years, and the curse is he usually anticipates what I'm going to say and says it better, so I'm going to skip what I was going to say because he said it better than I would. I think there are two dangers for the group, though. One, which Milo, I think, really did hit on, is there's a danger that, like the USA Today article, that people might interpret this effort as we're going to blow up the PSTN and every copper-based, hardwired-based network in the country. And that's just simply not the case. So I think we need to sort of depoliticize and take a little of the emotion out of this, and I think Milo nailed it. There is a role for many of the existing networks in the migration to IP, and it's naive and unsophisticated, I think, to assume that we're just going to go to a 100% IP network. And in the same vein, I just wanted to offer that I recommended to Nomi that we not stake out a hard position on wireless versus wired, because the reality of it is we're going to live in a world, particularly in the sharing context that we've talked about, where wired and wireless will coexist. And I think when you mention IP in today's environment, sometimes people make that knee-jerk jump to, it's all going to be wireless. And I don't think as a group we should move in that direction, but rather view a world that is heterogeneous of both wired and wireless connectivity.
You're removing all the fun out of the discussion.
Well, but I will make it more fun if you call on me before Milo next time, which has been my desire for 15 years.
It is all based on who puts their tent card up first. So.
Well, it's also based on the fact Milo's smarter than I am, so I'm still trying to think of something he hasn't.
I have a question on the scope for this work for the team. Obviously, IP transition is a very, very large topic. It could extend from anywhere from access into the network, inter-carrier exchanges. So there's very, very large. So from the description, I understand the scope is kind of really two or three things. One is the ubiquitous access or universal access, number one. Number two is public safety, anything related to public safety. So those are the two, I thought, main pillars of this team's work. But this is my understanding. Is that correct understanding of this scope of this thing? Because otherwise it could be very, very large scope.
I would say it is broader. It's those are two of the elements, but it is broader than that. It's also looking for opportunities for experiments or R&D that would support the understanding of how technology transitions would affect some of the enduring values of networks. So it's broader than just the two that you referenced.
So will this
at least that's my understanding. I think it was charged to me by the.
So will these technological evolutions and will that kind of a factor permeate into other areas of the current network, how the carriers exchange traffic, how do they route, or is it more in the access for consumers to get some services?
Right. Yeah, I might like to have somebody from the Commission answer that, but maybe I would say just from my own reading of it, the Commission has said that something like inter-carrier compensation is not a mandatory condition that has to be met in these trials. So that's one of the ones so just as an example, that's one of the ones that the Commission's saying we're not going to seek to answer that, with the new networks that we're looking at right at this time.
Yeah, we'll give Henning a shot. And we'll come back
Sure, thanks, Henning.
So, as Nomi is saying, this is a multifaceted problem and probably beyond the scope of any ability of any single working group to tackle, particularly because it's really an intersection, even more so than some of the other topics, of technology, economics, because it is a consumer technology that directly affects what people pay, and legal and other considerations that may play into that. And one of the complications is more than in some of the other areas, indeed, because we are in a particular technology that had a fairly strong regulatory history dating back more than 100 years, that can't be quite disentangled from that. The other piece is, when we talk about experiments, they really, we have to be clear that even in the IP transition order and further notice and every other single category that we have at our disposal that we had, there's really was the service-based ones, which, as Nomi said and pointed out, precisely was focused on, because it was meant to geographically constrain trial, at least for ones that we currently have one proposal for, but we also have one which is a larger regional one, the Indiana one, and then we have however, there are also other experimental efforts ongoing, for example, on rural broadband. So we have received a very large number, hundreds of indications of interest by organizations, some traditional, some not so, to provide broadband coverage in underserved and unserved areas. And thirdly, we also have experiments such as in the area of telephone numbering that are also experimentally based, and where we will actually have a workshop on March 25th, as has been announced, that might be of interest. I think almost all the companies represented here seem to be already sending a delegate or two, but since it is a technical piece, I'll mention it here as well. So the experiment goes beyond the Wire Center trial in that, and as Nomi said, in the Wire Center trial, interconnection was generally considered to be out of scope, but there may well be other considerations where that will come in. The general issue of data and how we deal with that, I think, is a generic one that we will have to tackle in any discussion, whether interconnection is part of it or not. I do want to make one additional point, namely that and it came up in the wireless versus wireline, is that the distinctions in IP and network are getting increasingly blurred when you look at, for example, public safety location. It is very hard to explain to people when you have, say, an interconnected VoIP service that happens to, that was originally seen as largely a landline service, classical over-the-top providers, but now could just as well running over LTE or over Wi-Fi or WISPs or who knows what. And consumers and public safety officials may well have very different expectations from what the current technology supports in that, and I think that will be one of the discussions. The whole point of IP is that you can change the transmission technology, and the service and the application is completely ignorant of that. That's what I would see as the central value proposition of IP, but some of our requirements and some of the technologies that sits on top of it haven't quite caught up with that. In particular, it also means that networks that may only support the transmission piece and not the application may suddenly need to support what happens on top, so to say. Namely, for example, those lower level networks may have very precise location information, since if they're physically located somewhere, fiber doesn't tend to move around. The devices attached to the fiber Wi-Fi device may, but the Wi-Fi access point probably knows pretty precisely where it is. And so looking at those interactions, I think, is very much both opportunity and challenge on the technology side as well as beyond that.
Marvin.
In the earlier look at this, we identified a large number of, I think we called them corner cases, of services that potentially problematic transition, fax, alarm monitoring, pacemaker readouts, and so on. And I want to make sure that they get covered in one of those working groups, because I think this is going to be the source of a lot of consumer angst about this transition.
Very good. Russ.
So I really like the way Nomi laid out the 4 working groups, and I think those are a good way to sort of set it up. I want to make a comment about Milo's comment, though. I just wanted to let everybody know the past IP transition working group that Henning was also part of and Nomi was part of, we have finished the paper, which sort of gives a little bit of a baseline and a lot of background on what the PSTN provided. So one of the things that's clear to me, though, is that's a reference what we have now is a very multimodal, high-capacity, different whole network. So it's like we have to be careful not to try, and I know you agree with not trying to force the old sort of requirements on the new capabilities, but just your point, I think, is around making sure there's some sort of a transition plan, that there's continuity of some sort in some of those areas. And I think there's some really basic guiding principles that may come out of this this year's TAC work. So, and we will, by the way, we'll get that paper out. I think Henning has one little edit to do.
Okay, yeah, you said that it was done, and I didn't.
It's done with, like, there's 2 sentences Henning has to edit. I don't want to make it sound really small, Henning, but just no pressure.
Okay, so it is that clarified, because if it was out there, that would be new news to me. But
it's 5 nines done.
But that's the old way of thinking.
It is about the old network to a high degree.
The only difference is it shall or shall not. Those are the only things that are up for grabs.
Right. Fred, go ahead.
Okay. You know, I really like the backgrounder that you did. I think there's a lot of good stuff here to think about, the notion of how we finish the job and focusing on where we're going. I wonder if it wouldn't be helpful to maybe do a little bit of inventory of what we think some of the barriers are, what could be done to actually remove those. You know, we have a good inventory, for example, of services that we're struggling with how we carry over. Maybe a little bit of thought into how could those services be transformed into something that could carry over. And also, I think there's an opportunity for incentives here. You know, our government has a lot of emphasis around green initiatives and other things we're trying to do. I think maybe a little bit of thought on how some of those things could be leveraged to accelerate this work would be really, really helpful. I'm not quite sure how that fits into the work group structure, but I think it'd be a useful thing to do.
Great.
Looking at how they
Yep.
can be.
Since I was involved with the PSTN, and my biggest concern back then was matching what we depend on today. One of the things that still concerns me is when you go from a homogeneous, regulated system that pretty much guarantees that things are going to work a certain way to a heterogeneous system, of especially a competitive heterogeneous system. How can you entice these companies to behave in a way that makes things work end to end? And I'm thinking in terms mainly of fire alarms, since that's my focus. But in fire alarm systems today, there are a number of rules based on PSTN qualifications that make them work, and we do have some experience. We have some experience with IP fire systems that have failed for unexpected reasons. People didn't even expect to see one little link in the whole network not have the backup power that it needed to pass the fire alarms through, and everything falls apart. And I thought about this back then, and thinking now, how, since you want a competitive network, which is a good thing, how can you guarantee or at least convince these companies that they have to meet a certain set of standards? And that's I think something that one of your working groups should look into, how to maintain competitiveness but still maintain standards.
Okay. Thanks, Greg. Thank you.
Great. David.
So a place I may differ a little, Greg, is I think it may be a very different set of standards. And something that I think might work on the earlier incarnations of the group shaped was the need for in some cases for us to really go back to basics. So I'm actually really glad that this year it sounds like you're going to take on some of these key questions, right? So we're really going to finally get down to what do we do about some of these key, particularly societal goals that we've had for the network over a sustained period. And I think when I say back to basics, it's really important to really go back and say, what was the original motivation, right? So almost for each thing, make sure the starting point shouldn't be how do we do it today.
Right.
The starting
I agree.
point should be going back and saying,
I agree.
what was the original motivation? What was the social need? Is that need still applicable? And a lot of them are, right? But understand it very clearly then. And then we can sort of ask the question, well, what are some really new ways? What are new and different ways that we could possibly do it? And we may come back to deciding, the old way is that's still the best way, and we should continue down that path. I think in a lot of cases we may decide that there are new and different ways to get not necessarily even the equivalent service. It may be something better, but it's likely to be something different that achieves the social needs. So I really want to encourage that kind of thinking. I've been starting to collect up examples where I see it out there, so I'll be happy to share some of those.
Great.
Volunteer for your group, Nomi.
No, I'm kind of tied up. I think that between, I don't know about thing 1, but thing 2 here is kind of subscribed. But I will kibitz, and I just do think that there's some opportunities. I also wonder if there could be some opportunities in these trials to actually, think this through and also experiment with some of the new ways of delivering alternative, as I say, ways of realizing those social benefits and important needs. We have to do it in ways that are mindful that, we can't expect if you've got a certain, say, startup company as a former VC, and it's delivering some kind of service, and if we start requiring, for example, that absolutely, this is just an extreme, I'm not saying anybody's suggesting it, but if you were to require that everybody be able to do text to 911, in the extreme, that could mean everybody that launches an app on a phone that has, any sort of messaging inside that app has to do text to 911. Well, it would be totally uneconomic, and your 911 facilities would be completely overloaded. I mean, they already are completely overloaded. So, I just go back to we have to also think through, I'd love to see some of this addressed in the trials, in the context of the business models, right, what are realistic things to impose that will not drive these companies out of business?
That's great. Kevin.
Yeah, I think David just caught much of what I wanted to say, but again, following up on Greg, I think one has to be a little bit cautious here with, I don't want to walk away from any legacy. I mean, that's incumbent upon us to preserve. But at the same time, it would be I think we'd have our heads in the sand if we didn't realize that the population as a whole is walking away from that legacy and may not even realize they're doing it. And so, the reality is that a lot of people don't have that power supplied line any longer, and then not necessarily even realizing that they don't have it until the power goes out, and then they wonder why they can't call the power company or something. But and they solve that problem. They pick up their cell phone. So, these kinds of questions have to get answered not just in the context of the existing network, but also in the context of the expectations of today's population, tomorrow's population, because otherwise I think you will get, both pointless requirements imposed, but also you'll miss, key problem areas that people are, perhaps not yet aware of simply because they're assuming things work the way they always worked. So, it's a balancing act that we have to go after.
Well said.
And, it may well be that you do find pockets of things that you have to consciously say, that doesn't work that way, but here's the cookbook menu on how to replace it or fix it, but yes, we're going to walk away from that. And, we've certainly done that in other aspects. I mean, DTV was probably the biggest example of walking away from a technology. There may be some of those, and I think we're better off identifying them so that we can consciously, say, hey, this is a limitation of that, and if you need a different kind of service, okay, here's how you get that service, than simply saying, gee, no service can be broken. Because I just don't think that's a realistic position.
I think that's well said, Kevin. I just wanted to add that I think just to the DTV example, I think this is an interesting example that if we do something like, say, go to DTV, and if there's enough consumer interest still in analog, it's interesting how what happens is a company goes after that opportunity. So many cable companies still provide analog service to analog televisions, right? Because they see it still as an opportunity. So I'm not saying that it won't eventually transition. Cable companies are still working towards transitioning, but I know our company saw it as an opportunity for a little while, so we kept our analog service up. We've kept it up for several years. Well, we're still transitioning away. I'm not saying we're not, but I think it's interesting how if we do leave something on the table, it's interesting how many companies still can find a way to provide that interim service too. So that's often a solution too.
Walter?
I just want to add one comment to something Dave said, that in addition to maybe not imposing unnecessary obligations on companies, when you look at the current environment, it's built often on a principle of walled gardens to protect specific services and capabilities. And as we look to the future, and I'll try to put this in an analogy of what you might not want to impose an obligation on text 911 for every application. You might want to provide an opportunity to lower the burden of actually doing that for a range of applications and let the innovators decide whether or not to incorporate it into their solution. So that we ought to look not only for not imposing unnecessary obligations, but taking away unnecessary restrictions for access to network resources and other capabilities that companies can make better use of in an innovative environment.
So Nomi, as you recall from our last PSTN go at this, one of the conclusions we reached was, look, there's organically PSTN is transitioning to various different apps, right? And we talked about over-the-top applications that are mostly being leveraged as a substitute. So that was happening organically, right? There was nobody was forcing anyone to do this. It was just happening, right? Whether it's wireless, a transition, or whether to one of these over-the-top apps. The thing that I thought we heard very clearly from the interviews, we talked to a bunch of people, was that how do we provide the same level of service that people enjoyed in the PSTN, right? Whether it's the elevator company that leverages PSTN or a consumer, and provide the same certainty, reliability, all the things we understand and live with in the PSTN world. So I thought that was a pretty interesting outcome. I don't know what we do with it, but the fact is it's kind of happening already.
Fish?
Yeah, maybe to build on some of these ideas, I think one of the difficulties of struggling with legacy models in the PSTN today is that the basis of competition has significantly shifted. It's shifted away from scale and robustness of a few services to choice and flexibility of many, many services. And when you're in a regime like that, it's contrary to the economic principle to move and protect all these other resources. But what I would say is that you can recast them, and I think it's building on what some of the other folks have said. If you have new technologies like SDN, as for instance, where you can build robust abstractions of the network and make them available to the point of let's carry those forward into new innovative capabilities that over-the-top providers are potentially building, they can abstract some of those services, whether it's 911 services or others that can be tagged on. Those are some opportunities where you'll actually have some amount of consistency of capability being available to new applications, but you're also allowing it to exist in a marketplace. Right? And I think it's really comes from the perspective of if we make that network more of a marketplace with SDN, with more APIs, and you preserve some of those capabilities and make them accessible, then the economic principle will hopefully bear them out. I don't know if that's something that you want to play in the face of regulatory need, but having said that, it's probably the way that it's actually going to play out.
That's a great point. Mm-hmm. Well said.
Peter, you flipped your card up and then down.
No, I actually changed what I was
Okay.
going to say.
Okay, great. Any final? Okay. Oh, Greg, that's right. You were
just to reply to David and Kevin. I don't want you to think that I'm opposed to change. I welcome it. I think it would be wonderful to have an all-IP system and a competitive system. But just to use your DTV analogy, you can switch the way that you transmit the television, but you still want to see and hear it. So the basic requirements are you see and you hear, but you're doing it a different way. And I'm saying the same about the reliability of a communications system. And I'm not against being competitive either. So it would be very interesting to see what a subgroup could come up with to entice competitive companies maybe to become more competitive, to say that they're certified as a fire alarm communications network.
Thanks, Greg.
Just to finally, final comment, interesting anecdote. I was sharing with a DoD forum, the working group elements, and sitting next to someone from the DoD. And after I'd finished, the person leaned over to me and said, I have a cabin, and I just installed a PSTN-based sensor system in my cabin. Is it still going to work? But it was a very telling comment, and it was actually, without going into the details, it's a new service, a new capability that has not previously existed. So there's still innovation going on in installation of new things that are PSTN-based. So often we think of things that are historic, that have been there. We need to protect some service that was established 25 years ago. But it was actually a bit of an eye-opener for me that he's talking about a brand new, never had this service before capability that is still based on PSTN. So I think working group needs to even be thinking about some of that as you make this discussion of transition. Any final comments from anyone beyond the immediate working groups? Certainly this is your opportunity. I meant to ask that one question about what's going on in cybersecurity, but I've lost the chance. Any final comments? Seeing none, I would like to recognize the key people that are making things happen. The chairs were very good at doing so as well, but I'd like our liaisons to stand up and take a bow. Henning, Julie, Bob over there.
We have to.
Walter, oh sure. Man, we don't have enough bowing going on in society. But behind the scenes, and it was referenced, and I appreciate that from the chairs, that so much of the work is actually undertaken or in supporting or sometimes leading roles for us, and really do appreciate that. It really makes this group function. Next, I'd like to turn things over to Walter, who is our designated federal officer. Any comments that you have about session, things that we need to be keeping in mind, things we need to be doing?
Yeah, but first,
Taskmaster.
But first, since you did such a nice job thanking us and also introducing the new members of this group, I would like to point out that we have now an official new chairman at today's meeting, not an interim chairman, and would like to thank you for both accepting the role as well as for getting us. I bumped into Tom a couple of days ago, and he was very much interested in whether you were going to finish on time and maintain his record. So that will be noted to the chairman and maybe included in our official meeting minutes.
Finish early in all likelihood.
Don't go too far.
Yeah. What a long speech.
Oh, okay, all right. Yeah.
I would.
Likelihood.
A couple of things. Would like you to finalize your working group. Some of you have asked if you can invite people to join the working group outside the TAC. We've always allowed that. So, and I recognize some of these areas require specialized expertise. Feel free to reach out and grab anybody you think you can lasso onto the working group against their will and bring them in and bring them into this activity. You're free to do that. And to borrow a maxim often applied in Dennis's hometown of vote early and vote often, meet early, and meet often with your work group members. Don't make it a backloaded process. So get people involved early and decide how you're going to proceed, and recognize we're going to complete the year with recommendations that are actionable by the commission. So that's the goal. Thank you.
Great. Julie, words of wisdom. High bar.
Oh, I didn't know that's what you were looking for. First of all,
each of the topics that we've talked about today and that we've asked for advice and recommendations from the TAC are important. I like to think of them as forward-looking, but not so far out that they're not directly relevant to the things that we're facing today. I can go through every one of these topics and think about how they tie in directly to issues the Commission has in front of it and issues that we're all kind of facing as we look down the road in the years ahead. They're important not only for the FCC, but for the industry, I think, collectively, and most importantly for consumers. As you do your work, I think we would ask, and you've heard this several times before, for actionable recommendations. I wouldn't put a number on it, but I think it's more helpful in the end if you can prioritize things and maybe get down to a few things. We often have terrific ideas, but when you come with 15 things out of each group, that's not really manageable. So I would just ask you, as you go through the process, to be thinking about specific things that the Commission could do. And also qualify, you heard me say this before, this doesn't mean you're going to recommend regulations. They could be ways you think that either the FCC or collectively how we can spark and motivate things to happen on the outside. I'll use the example of the multi-stakeholder process. So what came out of that with the Receivers Working Group was not the FCC should go off and establish regulations. It was, well, here's really the scope of the problem, and it's a community-wide problem, and here's how we think we might be able to tackle it with a new and innovative approach to it. So think about that as you go through things. We've got several big issues here. I mean, we have no expectation we're going to solve everything out of this process.
Well, some of us.
I think making progress along fronts is a terrific thing. Whether we're talking about cybersecurity, we're not going to solve all of that here, but if we can get pieces of it that we're making progress on, that's terrific. And lastly, I just want to extend the appreciation on behalf of the chairman and and the commissioners and all of the staff here for all of your work and participation in this. We know how busy you are, and this is taking a sizable chunk of time away from all of your other responsibilities that you have. And so we really do appreciate it, and hope you know that we take seriously the things that you recommend to us, and we try to translate them into actions. And lastly, I'd like to thank Dennis for taking on the job as chair, and all of the folks who agreed to be work group chairs this time around. We're really looking forward to this session, and so great work ahead. Thanks.
Great. We do have a special treat for this particular TAC meeting, and some number of you have already availed yourself of this opportunity, but actually we have a couple of people here from the Enforcement Bureau, and we have an Enforcement Bureau vehicle that is available for your review.
Yeah.
And Jim Higgins over here, stand up, Jim. Jim is at the front line in the Northeast region, so taking care of Northeast extends all the way to Chicago, so I don't know whether New York or Chicago would be, but
Chicago to Maine.
but there are many challenges that they face. We had an opportunity to spend a special time this morning with Jim and also with Scott Parker, and Scott just re-entered the room, so Scott actually is responsible for the development side of things for the enforcement team in Atlanta, and so both of them will be leading a tour downstairs. If you've not already signed up, sign up with Bob Pavlak. Raise your hand, Bob, so everybody sees where you are. And this would be a significant opportunity. And as you recognize, and it's part of the the Spectrum Receiver Working Group. This is a huge challenge right now as we transition into sharing, as we transition into broadband. The world of enforcement has gotten order of magnitude more complex, and obviously in moving forward we have, what is it? We have now 5 times the number of people in enforcement that we once had. They're not listening. That was you're focused just at the wrong time. No, in fact, we've reduced the number of people in enforcement considerably. So the challenge that the enforcement team has is enormous. So the things that we can do as a TAC to reinforce the needs in that area, and as well as come up with great ideas around enforcement, this will be very, very helpful. But again, kudos to Scott and to Jim for being with us, and we'll appreciate the tour, and I'm going to be on the tour. So. The final item for you just to take note of is that I guess one more on enforcement. I should give kudos to Dale. Dale has been the TAC champion for enforcement, and so Dale helped to arrange the session today, so that natural kudos to Dale, always doing great work that he does. Final item is just to remind you all that the 10th of June, we will be back here with great accomplishments to be reported upon and great progress to be made as we move through the rest of the year towards those actionable recommendations that you keep hearing about.
Future meeting dates are on the website now.
Right, and you should have all the dates now. The dates for the year have been posted. They are on the website and should be in your email as well. Should be on your calendars, actually, at this point. With that, we actually... Oh, Russ, please.
You a formal congratulations.
All right. Many thanks for that. And with that, we shall declare ourselves done. And unlike our previous chair, we're done 15 minutes early. So not just finishing on time. Maybe not carry that one up to the chairman's office.